Identify stakeholders. This is the first process in stakeholder management. In Identify Stakeholders, the project manager seeks to identify those people who the project could affect and who could be affected by the project. So our main goal, take a look at the screen, is identifying who the project could affect and who could affect the project. You can see on the screen the lady pointing to a chart. It's called a power interest grid. What she's doing is called a stakeholder analysis. You can see she's trying to plot the stakeholders, taking a look at their level of power and their level of interest. After that's done, we take all this information and compile it into a stakeholder register. It's a document in which we compile various bits of information about our stakeholders. We have their names, their organization, their project role. We're also quite keen on which phase are they most interested in. Are they internal or external? And are they a supporter of the project, or are they negative in that they want to shut it down? We call those negative stakeholders resistors. So in Identify Stakeholders, our main goal is to create a stakeholder register. So the inputs to this process are: 1, the project charter. Remember, your project charter has a preliminary list of stakeholders. The next input is business documents. These business documents are the business case and the benefits management plan, which may have initial information about stakeholders. The benefits management plan may also contain information about individuals and groups that will benefit from the project. The next input is the project management plan. Yes, I know it's a huge paradigm shift because we're used to seeing the project management plan in planning, but here we see it in an initiating process. Think about it. Identifying stakeholders is not a one-time thing. It's an iterative event. And for that reason, even though the project management plan may not be completely available when you are first identifying stakeholders, as you go through the project, you begin to get more information about how to better identify stakeholders and even how to better engage stakeholders. So the project management plan specifically contains the communications management plan and the stakeholder engagement plan. And both of these plans give some guidance, some insights as to how to engage stakeholders, and consequently some ideas of how best to identify these stakeholders, people that the project could affect and people who may be able to affect the project in a positive or even negative fashion. The next input is project documents. Various project documents exist. We know that at the time we are carrying out our initial identification of stakeholders, lots of documents will not be available. But as time goes on, we will have the change log becoming available, the issue log becoming available, and even requirements documentation, which could give more insights as to potential stakeholders. The next input is agreements. Agreements could be contracts, memorandums of understanding, letters of intent, SLAs. These could help us identify stakeholders. Our next input is enterprise environmental factors. Enterprise environmental factors at play here could be organizational culture, political climate, government or industry standards, such as regulations, product standards and codes of conduct, global, regional or local trends, and geographic distribution of resources. Our final input here is organizational process assets, as usual. The OPAs at play here are stakeholder register templates from the organization's repositories, instructions on how to fill in the stakeholder register, also the lessons learned repository with information about the preferences, actions, and involvement of stakeholders. Let's take a look at our tools and techniques. The first one is expert judgment, understanding of politics and power play in the firm. understanding the culture, the environment, the industry, and individual team members that may be stakeholders on the project. The next tool and technique is data gathering. Data gathering techniques could be questionnaires and surveys or brainstorming. Once you identify one stakeholder, you could interview that stakeholder to find out other stakeholders. And from those other stakeholders, you could identify more. So questionnaires and surveys and brainstorming could also be helpful here. The next tool and technique is data analysis. Under data analysis, we talk specifically about stakeholder analysis, which I mentioned previously. In stakeholder analysis, we seek to understand the stakeholders' level of power, level of interest, level of influence, and how they can affect the project, to mention a few. Some of the other information you're trying to glean from here are rights, legal rights of stakeholders, such as occupational health and safety, ownership. A person or a group of stakeholders may have a legal title to an asset or property. We could also think of those stakeholders owning resources needed on the project. We could also, again, think about the contributions that these stakeholders can make, not only in human resources, but in other ways, funding, and in addition to human resources, could they be advocates for the project? Could they promote the project's objective? And could they act as a buffer between the project and the powers that be in the organization? Also, under data analysis, we could think about document analysis, which is taking a look at the currently available project documents to glean stakeholders. The next tool and technique is data representation, and this refers to different ways we could represent the data gathered about stakeholders. We have the power interest grid, the power influence grid, the influence impact grid or the impact influence grid, and each of these are ways of illustrating and depicting stakeholder data. We have the stakeholder cube, which is a refinement of the grid models previously mentioned, and this combines elements into a three-dimensional model that can be used to better understand stakeholders. We also have the salience model. Look out for this one and read the definition carefully. Salience refers to the ability of a stakeholder to impose their will. Stakeholders who can impose their will could include union leaders and such. The next bullet here is directions of influence as we look into data representation. This classifies stakeholders according to their influence on the work of the project or on the project team. We could classify stakeholders as upwards, senior management, for example, people in the C-suite, downwards, the team or the specialist contributing knowledge to the project, outwards, stakeholders that are outside of the project, such as suppliers, government, and public, as well as end users, and maybe even regulators. We could also look at sidewards direction of influence, that is among peers of the project manager. For example, middle managers who are in competition for scarce resources, project managers who are also in competition for one reason or another, and any other people that collaborate with the project manager in sharing information. We could also look at directions of influence as prioritization. We need to prioritize stakeholders on our projects, especially on the very large projects where the stakeholder community membership rapidly changes, or when the relationship between stakeholders and the team within the project are complicated. Our last tool and technique is meetings. We need meetings to conduct interviews, maybe to fill in questionnaires and surveys, or facilitate the meeting of the minds so that we can better understand who our stakeholders are. The stakeholder analysis described under data analysis is meant to be done with the project manager and the team, definitely not the project manager in isolation. The more people take part in this, the better. Let's talk about our outputs. Big output, stakeholder register. The stakeholder register contains identification information of stakeholders, assessment information of stakeholders, and stakeholder classification. The next output is change requests. As we go through the project, what happens? Changes begin to emerge. Now, at first, when we do our initial identification of stakeholders early in the project, there'll be no changes, but as the project begins to evolve, what happens? You find more stakeholders, and as a result of identifying stakeholders, various things could happen. You could change your project management plan. You may find your project documents changing. Of course, you need to update your stakeholder register and do multiple iterations of stakeholder analysis. Our next output is project management plan updates. As I mentioned a few seconds ago, you may need to update your project management plan. We could look at updating requirements. We could look at updating our requirements management plan. We could look at updating our communications management plan as well. We may also, as a direct result of identifying stakeholders, have to update our risk management plan. We may also need to update our stakeholder engagement plan. Our next output is project documents updates. As mentioned, they could be updates to various project documents that could include, but are not limited to, the assumptions log, the issue log, and the risk register. And that concludes our review of identify stakeholders.